We're in the middle of thinking about a very difficult question. Does cognition penetrate perception? This is a question that's very difficult even to understand. I hope now that we do understand something about the question. Is there cognitive penetration perception? But to get there, we had to think carefully about perception and also about what it might mean for cognition to influence perception directly or indirectly. We now need to go on and think, what evidence supports the existence of the cognitive penetration of perception, or what evidence might count against that. But before we do that, I think we should think about why we care at all about this issue. Now we've understood what the issue is. Now, of course, you can skip this. You can skip ahead and come back. You can do it in any order you like. I encourage you to just follow your own interests. If you're not interested in this, skip on. If you're interested in the significance, let's do it. So here's something very striking. Observations that people make can change the theories they hold. This is a lovely report from The Economist about how observations that people have made of hybridization in a variety of species, not just plants and bacteria, but also animals, have led them to change the way that they think about evolutionary processes. Very simple idea. Observations can change your theory. And this isn't a matter of, some kind of fancy or something like that, as it were, when the, some kind of change in fashion causes you to remove your jacket. I think I might remove the jacket, actually. It's pretty warm in here. You see that I brought the jacket along. I'm wearing the jacket, doing the whole thing. Change in fashion might cause you to take off one jacket and put on a different jacket. Actually, I got this jacket from a charity shop, probably because of a change in fashion, you see. When you observe things and your theory changes, it's not supposed to be like a change in fashion. It's supposed to be some kind of rational relation between the observation and the theory that you reject. The theory is supposed to disconfirm the observation. That's a very simple point. But why is it interesting? Well, if you think that perception cognitively penetrates, said it the wrong way around, haven't I? Stop, Steve. If you think that cognition penetrates perception, if you think that, then you don't think that observations are somehow independent from theories. And so it becomes a tricky question for you. Why would it be rational to reject theory on the basis of these observations? Let me explain. So here's the simple picture. I'll make some observations. In the case I was just talking about concerning hybridization, and those lead me to reject a theory, in this case in favour of a revised version of it. Pretty simple. And this is just how things stand if we think that there is no cognitive penetration. In this case, you and I might start with completely different theories, but the observations are common to all of us. We share the observations. But now look what happens if we think that there is cognitive penetration. Well, in this case, you might think the same thing can happen. And in a way that's true. I make some observations and they might cause me to reject a theory. But the tricky thing is that the theory will be part of what determines which observations I make. That's what the thesis of cognitive penetration says. Anything I believe or know might influence my observations, might change the character of my visual, auditory, haptic or other perception. So if you start off and you've got a theory that I'm going to call theory 1, that could have some influence on your observations. I've got a theory that I'm going to call theory 2, that's me, and that will influence my observations. It follows from this that even though you and I might encounter the same stimuli in the world, So the stimuli are common to us. The observations that we make could be entirely different. And because the observations could be entirely different, there's no guarantee that you will rationally reject the same theory that I do on the basis of those observations. So on this view, really, observation should be playing no special role in whether we reject a theory or not. To put it another way, we're stuck in a kind of loop of theory and observations, and ultimately it seems choosing or rejecting a theory is not something that we can defend on the basis of mere observation. So I was just saying that if we accept that cognition penetrates perception, we can't regard ourselves as choosing or rejecting a theory merely on the basis of observation. This idea is nicely captured by Stokes. He says, the assumption identified and challenged by proponents of cognitive penetration, some of them, is that perceptual observation is neutral with respect to the theories being tested. It can safely and reliably be used as evidence for or against theory. This is the view that you would be struggling to hold on to, or indeed rejecting, if you thought that cognition penetrates perception. But wait, I think there's a question on this. I know that you want to ask this question. It's an excellent question. Thank you. But didn't you just argue, Steve, that's me, right? Didn't I just argue that perception was theory laden? Good question. Well done. I did just argue that perception was theory laden. That was indeed the point of talking about these moving objects. And the idea was that although you're getting incomplete and often fragmentary information about the object's positions in space, because they're often invisible to you, your perceptual processes nevertheless patch together a coherent trajectory for them. They could only be doing that, I suppose, on the basis of something like a little theory about the way that objects move. And at least there's very strong evidence for that view. That's probably the dominant view about how perception of object trajectories works. It's a true view, I think. Look carefully at the evidence. So now I'm in a bind, aren't I? Because I think that perception is theory laden. What you perceive depends on not just the sensory inputs that you get, but also a background theory about the movement of objects. But the interesting thing is this: we can make discoveries about the nature of the principles underpin your background theory. So here's a famous example from an experiment by McCluskey and colleagues. And what they did was they took various shapes and they asked people to imagine that they're looking down a tube the direction of the arrow. You see the arrow? They asked people to look in the tube in the direction of the arrow. Imagine that they inserted a ball there with great force into the tube, so it sort of span around the tube, and then to draw the trajectory that the ball would emerge on. And what you can see here is that 51% of the subjects in one of their experiments produced a spiral trajectory. They thought the ball would spiral out. And that's indeed the view of the impetus mechanics. But it's not what would happen at all. Not what would happen at all. In fact, if this was really done and we used some kind of very good video camera to capture the motion, what you'd see is the object exiting the spiral in a straight line. What Newtonian physics tells you as well. Why is this interesting? Well, what we can do is use experiments. I'm not going into the details here. It would be good to go into the details. I really can't do that. Not without another week, of course. Anyway, don't tempt me. You'll regret it. What we can do is find out what kind of principles underpin perception of objects. Once we know what those principles are, we can actually make use of them to work out why it is that some scientific views seem so appealing, even though they appear not to be correct. So Aristotelian physics appears to be largely based on principles that govern how objects are perceived. Once we more recently, in the last 2 or 3 decades, have understood something more about the principles on which our perceptual systems operate, we can appreciate two things. We can appreciate why it was that Aristotelian physics seemed so compelling, and we can see that what appeared to be observations which support the theory were really just artifacts of the way our perception. So we can say that those, what appeared to be observations supporting the theory, are not in fact observations supporting the theory at all. So it's true, I think, that your perception is theory laden. So I don't think Stokes is at all right to say that the assumption being challenged should be that perceptual observation is neutral with respect to the theories being tested. That was not true in the case of the argument between proponents of Aristotelian physics and proponents of Newtonian physics. If you're studying Descartes, by the way, if you're studying Descartes later this term, this is terribly relevant for Descartes, because Descartes was one of those people who realised that the Aristotelians had got things wrong, partly because they relied too much on the basis of sensory appearances. They took sensory appearances to truly reflect how the world was. They weren't prepared to take seriously the idea of perceptual processes. That's my Descartes. My Descartes wasn't very interested in at all. He wasn't very interested in evil demons and all that kind of. I have to tell you, when I taught first years Descartes, they really hated it because it didn't involve these traditional themes. I think Descartes was a philosopher whose main interests were really about how you get from perception to supporting or rejecting theories, and he had a lot to say about that. Skepticism played a very small role. But anyway, sorry, I digress. You wouldn't like my Descartes, but this is absolutely central to how, in my view, Descartes' thinking. The point is that your perceptual observations are far from neutral with respect to all theories. That isn't quite right. But the essence of what Stokes is saying is right. We could smarten up a bit, we could sharpen it up a bit. We could sharpen it up a little bit by saying this: perceptual observation may side with one particular theory, and indeed historically it has, it's sided with Aristotelian. But which theory perceptual observation sides with is independent of which theory you hold. As a great deal of experimental research has shown, whether you're trained in contemporary physical theory or not will make little difference to that your perceptual systems operate. Your perceptual systems, in the mind of the greatest physicist, will still deliver object trajectory in line with a broadly Aristotelian physics. Just the kind of physics that people intuitively, without training in physics, tend to latch onto. Very good. So I want to suggest that there isn't actually a problem here with accepting both cognition does not penetrate perception, and that perception is theory laden. Perception involves commitments to particular kinds of claims about the physical property of objects. So there we're just finessing a few. Okay, now at this point we're still neutral on whether cognition does or does not penetrate perception. We're just talking about why the question of whether it does is interesting, significant. The thought is that it's significant because it bears on the relation between observation and theory. If you think that observation can provide you with simple, straightforward reasons to reject a theory, then you probably are committed to the idea that cognition does not penetrate. But of course, not everybody is committed to that idea, even antecedently of discussing cognitive penetration. And to this end, it's worth just taking a look at what the pragmatists, on their view, observation plays no special role. So here's Peirce. He says, in a paper called The Fixation of Belief, he says, truth is distinguished from falsehood simply by this, that if acted on, it should, on full consideration, carry us to the point we aim at and not astray. The classical pragmatist idea, this is what most people think of when they think about pragmatists, though of course Peirce was an incredibly rich thinker. And in later work, he actually came to revise his views on this matter. But this is certainly a view that's been, kind of quite influential. Or take John Dewey. So John Dewey, writing quite a bit later, in 1907, he said, "The criterion of the worth of an idea is the capacity of the idea to operate in fulfilling the object for the sake of which it was projected. Capacity of operation in this fashion is the test, measure, or criterion of truth." So you can see here that for Peirce and Dewey, on their theory, perhaps they're right, perhaps they're wrong, I'm not saying, but if they're right, observation plays no special role. What's crucial for accepting or rejecting a scientific theory is that it should essentially lead us to success in our actions. It should enable us to, build aeroplanes and so on. Now, of course, this is very difficult theory to work out in detail. And if you think about the ideas about evolutionary theory with which I started, why should certain observations about hybridization change your views about how evolution works? Quite difficult to apply pragmatist theory. So I'm far from suggesting to you that the pragmatist theory is right. What I do want to suggest is it's far from obvious that the simple picture about observations allowing us to rationally reject theories with which I started is a compulsory picture. Proponents of cognitive penetration may say that that's a mistaken picture to start with. All I'm saying here is that we're in very deep waters. Now, it seems to me wrong to take a side independently of having some really quite compelling. I'm not offering those. I'm not taking a side. What I've attempted to suggest then is just this. Whether cognition penetrates perception matters for how observations relate theories. That's the message so far. But that's not the only reason why the question of whether cognition penetrates perception matters.